lieutenant colonel said to me that in 2 days he saw 120 North Korean and Russian troops killed. In one incident, he said he saw in the space of 4 minutes about 15 North Korean troops killed by drone. So it was a very intensive battle. And after that, the Russians and North Koreans seem to have been driven out of the village, and they are not making any more attempts to take that village. And there have been radio intercepts from Russian officers suggesting that the North Koreans are not prepared to go back and try and take that village again.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time I'm joined by Maxim Tucker. Maxim is the Times' Ukraine correspondent, and he's been reporting from the front lines in Ukraine since 2022. Maxim, good to see you again. Ukraine has launched one of the largest mass drone strikes against Russia this week, with some of the targets hundreds of kilometres from the border. And the Engels air base in particular has been struck multiple times. So where are Russia's air defences?
I think this is a demonstration of Ukraine's increasing confidence and capability in launching deep-range airstrikes into Russia. Russian air defenses, they have them. They're still shooting down Ukrainian drones, but Ukraine is using quite sophisticated attacks. They fire decoy drones, they fire kamikaze drones, and then they have some of the long-range drones mixed in with them. And this is, used alongside in tandem with British Storm Shadow and American ATACMS missiles, and some Ukrainian homemade missiles, such as Neptune missiles as well, to overwhelm the defenses. So the decoys are used to kind of use up a battery of Russian missiles, and then the real kind of missiles go through. And the Russians, of course, can't afford to not shoot down any of these targets in case they are real targets. So Ukraine has ramped up its own domestic drone production, which is pretty cheap. It's very much cheaper than everything the West is supplying, and is using those to great effect to strike long distances inside Russia now.
And is this proof that actually stepping up the production of those Neptune missiles could actually fill a gap should there not be enough ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles in future?
Well, some of Ukraine's missiles can help that. They're not as sophisticated as ATACMS. They're not as sophisticated as Storm Shadow. They might not be as good at penetrating hard targets as Storm Shadow particularly. So they have different capabilities. But, hitting large targets, infrastructure targets, such as oil depots and ammunition warehouses, that is still something Ukraine is able to do, both with its own missiles and increasingly with these long-range drones as well.
In response, Russia has launched a major ballistic and cruise missile attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, forcing the power grid to shut down in places. Is this the kind of attack that we'll like to see more of, or is it one of those tit-for-tat situations that will be self-contained? What do you know about Russia's ability to continue this kind of attack?
Well, I think Russia has shown that it's very willing to expend a huge amount of missiles and drones on Ukraine in attempts to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure. I think what's new and interesting is that Ukraine is increasingly able to match those aerial attacks and to strike deep inside Russia. And it's particularly interesting that, as you say, Russia cannot intercept all of those Ukrainian attacks, and Ukraine is inflicting really serious damage on Russian military infrastructure. Now, I think this is a point where Trump is expected to come in and push for peace talks, and both sides are vying for an upper hand before Trump does that. So we might see, before any meaningful peace talks, a kind of intensification of this deep strike warfare on both sides. They try and cripple each other and give themselves the best possible bargaining position.
So, Maxim, I just want to talk about your latest report, a recent report you've done. You've obtained the first account by Ukrainian forces of close quarters fighting with North Korean troops inside Russia. Who did you speak to and where were they?
I spoke to the 33rd Separate Assault Brigade. They're known as the Big Cats, and they were fighting in a village called Makhnovka in the Kursk region. This was actually a really important strategic battle because it's a place where, if the North Koreans and the Russians had been able to take hold of that village, they could push on to Sudzha, the largest town that Ukraine has been able to occupy in Russia, and effectively cut off the Ukrainian advance deeper into the Kursk region. Recently, Ukraine has reinforced its efforts in Kursk and has attempted to take more territory inside Kursk, again as part of this attempt to have a better negotiating position when it comes to peace talks with Putin. and if some of those are the best equipped brigades, that they are the best trained units that are pushing forward into Kursk, and if they'd been cut off and the North Koreans had gone in behind them, then it would have been really difficult for the Ukrainians to escape from that.
And you spoke in particular to Lieutenant Colonel Leopard, as you write his name being. Can you tell me a little bit more about him?
That's his call sign. So he's a senior commander in this battalion, um, and he is coordinating different units using different advanced technologies. It's become a war of technology now. The Russians are increasingly using first-person view drones with fiber optic, very kind of thin fiber optic cables attached to them, so that they can negate the Ukrainian jamming, and that's proving quite effective and difficult. For the Ukrainians to deal. So the Russian FPV drones have a fiber optic cable attached to them, which defeats the Ukrainian jamming, and so that's giving the Russians an advantage in the air. In Makhnovka, it was interesting because the North Koreans were attacking, but they don't seem to have drone capabilities. They're not equipped to use drones. And this lieutenant colonel was telling me that in the fighting inside that village, the Ukrainians were able to have the upper hand because they were in the air above the North Koreans, and the North Koreans didn't really know how to deal with these drones. The North Koreans were also walking forwards in single file into minefields, and people were being taken out by these mines, and the North Koreans would just carry on marching past them with paramedics dragging them off the battlefield, the wounded off the battlefield.
It's really interesting when you're talking to somebody of that professionalism. How do they react when they're describing the way they're seeing the North Koreans basically being thrown into the field and allowed to die in that way?
Well, I think at this point in the war, 3 years on, a lot of people, like men like him, are very matter of fact about the nature of death and killing. It's been going on for so long. I mean, I think there is still some element of horror about how needlessly lives are being thrown away, and surprise still at the North Koreans, that they're willing to sacrifice their soldiers in a very alien land, which has really very little benefit to them in doing so. Um, and the lack of concern for the soldiers that the Russians are commanding is clear, and there is some shock within the Ukrainian ranks about that, but they're getting increasingly used to it.
Mm. And this was a mixed unit, right, of North Korean and Russian troops. What did you learn about how well trained they are and how effectively they're working together?
So yeah, the North Koreans are inserted into Russian units, and they're given Russian uniforms, Russian equipment, so they can't easily be identified as North Koreans. But obviously, they're speaking different languages. The radio intercepts are making clear that they're North Koreans, and visually you can see that some are North Koreans, whereas compared to ethnic Russians. Now, they do seem to be quite well trained troops and physically fit. This is what the lieutenant colonel was telling me. And they're good at kind of clearing houses and establishing positions inside villages, but they really have no ability to deal with the modern nature of warfare. They just don't understand that they're being spied on from the sky at all times. They're still hiding in tree lines and not realizing they can be recognized with thermal imaging cameras, and they're being taken out quite easily by drones as a result of that, and suffering very heavy casualties. They also need to have Russian guides who are attached to them to show them where to go and help them interpret their surroundings, because it's so different from anything that they've ever seen in North Korea. And this unit had captured one of the Russian guides who was providing a lot of detailed information to the Ukrainians about how they work together.
And why would there be such efforts to conceal the fact that they are North Koreans?
I think for Putin, it's still quite embarrassing that he has to rely on another nation to defend Russian borders, and they're trying to minimize the images that get out around the world and inside Russia, for the purposes that it doesn't suit his propaganda narrative that he is the guy that guarantees Russia's security. Um, of course, inevitably, people are starting to be captured. We've seen two North Koreans captured and paraded on Ukrainian television. So it is getting out anyway, and some of that will probably start to permeate into Russia, that they're having to rely on North Korea for their own defense.
And what have you learnt about the North Korean soldiers opting to not be taken alive?
So there's probably considerable pressure on North Koreans not to be captured, because of repercussions for their families back home and anything that the regime, Pyongyang regime, would do to their families if they are allowed themselves to be captured alive. And there have been stories about Russians executing wounded North Koreans, North Korean officers executing their own wounded soldiers rather than try and retrieve them or allow them to be captured. But inevitably, the nature of warfare is such that people get wounded and surprised and surrounded, and there have been these two prisoners of war at least so far, and I think we can expect to see more. And it will become increasingly difficult and ineffective to use those methods to try and hide the fact that North Korean troops are fighting inside Russia.
And in the case of this village, which you write about, Makhnovka, what's the situation now? And can you describe how the North Koreans were routed?
So yes, so the North Koreans had set up 3 machine gun positions inside this village, and they were trying to control the area using these positions, and they fortified the areas, and they came in by surprise. They'd flanked the Ukrainian units who weren't ready for them at the time. So this 33rd Separate Assault Brigade had to go in and clear them out in house-to-house fighting. They did do that, and obviously with the help of drones, which the North Koreans weren't using, that gave them an advantage. They also had the Ukrainians had tanks and armored personnel carriers, which they deployed inside the village, and they were able to drive out the North Koreans and hold on to the village. Now, the fighting in that village has been very fierce over the past couple of days. The lieutenant colonel said to me that in 2 days he saw 120 North Korean Russian troops killed. In one incident, he said he saw in the space of 4 minutes about 15 North Korean troops killed by drone. So it was a very intensive battle. And after that, the Russians and North Koreans seem to have been driven out of the village, and they are not making any more attempts to take that village. And there have been radio intercepts from Russian officers suggesting that the North Koreans are not prepared to go back and try and take that village again.
And at the moment in Kursk on the ground, there isn't that much movement, though, is there?
There's been some movement of the Ukrainians trying to push further into Kursk, and there was reinforcements in an effort to do that. It hasn't got as far as the Ukrainians would have hoped, but a lot of what is happening there is still quite unclear. The Russians launched a counter-offensive to try and cut off the Ukrainians and put pressure on the units that are being reinforced. So there is still a lot of heavy fighting, but yes, as ever in this war, it's increasingly difficult to make territorial gains because as soon as you come out into the open, you're exposed to drones and you're exposed to artillery, and it's very, very difficult to make gains in the current environment, especially when it's so cold.
And we talked before about the importance of holding on to at least part of Kursk as leverage for any ceasefire talks that might take place. How aware was the commander that you spoke to of how his particular operation fits into the bigger picture and the objectives?
I think when we spoke, he was tired. He had a limited amount of time because he had to go back to the front in a few hours' time. And he's really thinking about the daily grind, the job that they're doing in the field and the job that they're doing in the trenches, how to protect his men better, how to give them an advantage on the battlefield, how to spot the kind of technology that the Russians are using and overcome it. And his particular specialism is communication. So he's trying to ensure that every single Ukrainian soldier in his unit has secure internet wherever they are on the battlefield so that they can send secure communications and that they can get kind of good maps of the area and see where the Russians are, can get drone feeds that will help them with their mission. While the Russians are obviously trying to jam that internet, he's trying to jam the Russian internet at the same time, and each side is playing a cat and mouse game where they're trying to hit each other's electronic warfare equipment or hit each other's communications equipment with missiles. And so it's a kind of intense game where he's got to use his brain a lot and focus a lot on that.
And given that the Russians have these drones that can avoid jamming by electronic warfare, does that mean that the Ukrainians are lagging behind in this capability and it's actually having an effect?
So the Russians have got the fiber optic cables. So they are actually, they've pioneered a method that is ahead of the Ukrainians, and they are able to use these FPV drones using a cable without being jammed by the Ukrainians, and that's kind of the next step in this warfare. That's giving the Russians a significant advantage in areas where they can do that. Now, the Ukrainians have also tried to respond, develop their own fiber optic cable drones, but they're still kind of rolling that out. They don't have them in numbers. They've also, interestingly, developed some drones which have kind of shotgun attachments, like two big barrels that are flying into the air. And there's been some videos of it on the internet recently that you can watch about these drones flying up to other Russian drones and shooting them with these kind of shotgun technology attached to it, and shooting down other drones in the air. So we're now in a place where drones are shooting each other down in the air, taking this counter-drone warfare in the air, and the skies are very busy indeed.
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, in terms of the advancing that part of Kursk, what kind of air cover do the Ukrainian troops have?
Well, I think they're still relying on jamming equipment to hold the Russians back in that area. And they've obviously brought in their kind of anti-air defenses further behind them as well to try and create an umbrella for those Ukrainian troops. But because that salient into Kursk is now increasingly narrow, the Russians have squeezed it a lot. It means that some of the air cover at the front is going to be more difficult to provide. We haven't really seen, or we can't tell from where we are now, what kind of difference F-16s are making to the front line. Some of this big air attack over the last couple of days suggests that there are new capabilities if the Ukrainians are able to launch such massive attacks with lots of missiles being fired at the same time, Storm Shadows, which are of course launched by jets. But I think that area of the Kursk salient is vulnerable to the Russians, and they are hitting them with these heavy glided bombs regularly as well. And I think that is going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to going forward.
The British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has agreed to a 100-year partnership with Ukraine and said he wants to put the country in the strongest possible position for 2025. Do you think this is timed to have a bearing on any decisions that Trump might have, early decisions in terms of support for Ukraine?
Well, yeah, it's a very vague and general commitment, isn't it? And I think it's very much timed, in the final days of Biden's presidency, to say to Trump, look, this issue is not going to go away, and if you want to maintain this kind of special relationship and this kind of alliance, these are our priorities, and we've demonstrated commitment. I think it was really important that Starmer has gone to Kiev, because he hasn't been to Kiev yet in the 6 months of his premiership. So he had to kind of show that at some point, and this is as good a time as any, I suppose. But the 100-year commitment, it's very general, vague. There's been some talk of a new mobile air defense system in Ukraine that the UK will provide. For obvious reasons, maybe they don't want to specify what kind of system that is, but it's not something that will give the Ukrainians a huge amount of confidence going into January, February, I think.
US policy towards Ukraine and Russia will become more obvious, obviously, in the coming days and weeks. Do you ever get the chance to gauge the opinions of people like the commander that you spoke to this time about whether and in what circumstances they would want a ceasefire?
The most common answer you get when you ask this kind of questions is that we just have to do our jobs. The Russians are here; we've got to stop them. No one else is going to do it. A lot of people will say they're tired of the war, they want to go home, they want to see their families, but they don't see that they have a choice. And people are skeptical, of the motives that Trump has for having a ceasefire, and whether in fact it's realistic to say, because obviously Putin hasn't changed his war ambitions and doesn't seem to be demonstrating an eagerness to come to the peace table. So I think a lot of people are saying we'll believe it when we see it. It's good perhaps that there is this pledge that Trump has made to increase support to Ukraine if Putin is not willing to talk. That's something the Ukrainians would like to see anyway, that more support for the US from the US. But I think a lot of people are just stuck in the day-to-day in the trenches. They think about how to get through the next 24 hours rather than what their political leaders are going to decide for them.
That commander you told me about when you said he was very tired, how long had he been deployed to the front line for? Had he had a break at all, or has he been there for, I don't know, how long?
Well, I think he'd been involved in a kind of pitched battle for 48 hours, probably catching a little bit of sleep here and there. The fighting was really, really intense for those 2 days, and there'd been the previous weekend when they'd been pushed back had been difficult as well. But the Ukrainians have this advantage where, because they are fighting, close to their home territories. A lot of them can go home on leave and get a bit more rest and respite than the Russians, who are kept there, all the time because they're worried that they might go home and never come back to their family to the front line.
And is there any appetite when you talk to these soldiers for the presence of foreign troops in a training capacity, or even a peacekeeping capacity in the way that it's being talked about at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainians would love to see Western troops on the front line with them. I think they'd be very happy at that idea. I think they acknowledge that it's probably not realistic and it's their cross to bear at the moment. But yes, a lot of Ukrainians who fought since 2014 have fond memories of the trainings that were carried out in Western Ukraine by the UK, by the US, and how useful that was. And also the kind of relationships that it established between different armed forces. And Western armed forces learned a lot from their Ukrainian counterparts. And when there are these trainings, even in Western countries, Western forces are learning from a new kind of warfare and how the Ukrainians have to fight it. And things are being tested on the battlefield that are very useful for NATO forces to understand and get better at.
And Maxim, you are due to head out to Ukraine for more reports very soon. Now that we're coming towards the end of the third year of fighting in this particular phase of the fight, what will you be looking for, and how do you think your reporting and your focus might change?
Well, I think it's going to be days after Trump's inauguration, so we'll be looking at the diplomatic efforts. What's happening with Trump's efforts to push Ukraine towards a ceasefire deal, and the inside negotiations that are underway with the Zelensky administration. So we'll be looking at the diplomacy. At the same time, how well equipped are the Ukrainians to carry on the war while those negotiations are happening? What happens to US supplies, whether they dry up quickly, whether they're not reaching the places they need to reach on the battlefield, and this very precarious situation around Pokrovsk, where Ukraine is now starting to fortify the border of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which is an area where there hadn't been land fighting on before, and that's home. The capital of that region is home to 1 million people, and so they're really concerned about Russian forces being on their doorstep. And then obviously what's happening in Kursk is going to continue to be of interest.
Plenty to talk about next time. Maxim Tucker, good to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.